Righty. Thank you everyone for joining. My name is Stephanie Shear. I'm the Senior Director of Research and Innovation here at ACES. Welcome to our monthly webinar. Today we have a fantastic topic to cover. And again, we do these webinars monthly. Typically we do them on the first and third Wednesdays of every month, but we're doing kind of a special series right now. And so we're just doing them once a month, but hoping to impart some good quality information so that when you're making decisions for yourself and your loved ones, you have the best information possible to make the decisions that are right for you. This is a judgment-free zone. Everybody has access to the chat and the Q&A. Only myself and Crystal can see the chat. So if anybody wants to remain anonymous, have no fear. We are anonymous and we will get your questions answered. So please put them in as you have them. And we hope you enjoy today's topic. So a little bit about our guest speaker today. Crystal started her financial career in the banking industry back in 2002. After 6 years in the banking world and after graduating from Texas State University with a degree in business management, she joined Northwestern Mutual as a financial representative. Over the years, Crystal has held many roles serving clients as well as serving on leadership teams. Her youngest son and her passion for the special needs community was born in 2018. During that time, she noticed that very few financial advisors who have the expertise and knowledge needed to do the important planning that is necessary for an individual with a special healthcare need exists. As a special needs mom herself, her financial planning practice specializes in serving families who have a loved one with special needs by providing comprehensive financial planning with special consideration for the loved one with special needs. She and her team have dedicated their time and knowledge to delivering only the highest level of client experience to the families that they serve. Again, Crystal, thank you so much for being here today, and I will let you take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, thank you for joining us today. If you're here, hopefully it's because you wanted to learn a little bit more about creating financial security for your loved one with special needs. I usually start off by going through this slide to tell you all about me, but she did such a great job. I don't even know if we need to spend much time on this. Other than I'll just take a minute to brag about the picture on the bottom of the page. That's my family. I always love bragging about them. But the gentleman you see in the back there, that's my husband, who is also one of my business partners. And then our two boys, the oldest in the back, he looks like the smallest, but he's actually my oldest. That's Olivier, he's 8. And then our youngest, Stellan, in the front there, he is our little guy with special needs. And then our firstborn, I should say, Cassie, our dog, she just turned 16. So that's my little family, a little bit about me. The other thing I'll just mention is that I do work with families from all across the country to really work on special needs planning. We do comprehensive planning, but we really take a special consideration for your child with special needs because it really does need to be integrated with your entire financial plan. So, and as you look at my practice today, 100% of the families that I work with are in the special needs community. So that's all I do all day, every day. But let's kind of jump in. So I always like to hit you guys with some statistics because I find that this is really interesting. And a lot of times if you're maybe laying in bed at night, having these fears and worries kind of swirling around in your head, maybe you'll take some comfort in knowing that you're certainly not alone, that a lot of us are feeling that way. But I found this very interesting. 82% of caregivers are concerned that they do not have enough financial resources to last their disabled relative's lifetime. I hear this one a lot. And then 77% of caregivers are concerned that they won't be able to retire. So whenever I ask my clients that I'm working with, while we're talking about goals and planning, I'll say, when do you ideally want to retire? And I can tell you that it's not uncommon for someone to say, well, I can't ever retire. And oh, by the way, I also can't die. Those things can never happen. So I've heard that before. If you're feeling that way, I understand. I hear you. I don't know if that's a feasible plan, but we can certainly work with that. But 87% of caregivers are also concerned about what's going to happen to their child when mom and dad are no longer living. So I think for me, this is probably the one that keeps me up the most at night. Because in my opinion, no one's going to love my child the way I do. No one's going to make sure that they're going to stay safe like I will, and all of those kind of things. No one knows him better than I do. And so the idea of leaving this earth and him still being here, especially kind of in his vulnerable state, that's a very scary kind of thing to think about. But I will say that after doing some planning for ourselves, I do sleep better at night, knowing that if that were to happen, there's a very intentional and really thought out plan in place. And so that's my goal for you all today, is to kind of give you some things to think about, hopefully provide some clarity and some direction. But the last two bullets on this that I highlighted to me are the most interesting. So 67% of parents have not set up a special needs trust. That's kind of a big majority in my opinion. Only 23% of families have a formal financial plan for their dependent, and only 37% are working with a financial advisor. So I'm a numbers girl, I'm in finance. So when I look at this data, what it really tells me is there's a lot of moms and dads or caregivers who are really worried. They've got a lot of fears, a lot of anxiety, not knowing what the future holds and if they're going to be able to, provide the level of support that's going to likely be needed. And for whatever reason, not very many families are getting the support or guidance that they need. I don't know if they can't find it, if they're not sure where to find it, or maybe they're just not feeling confident about asking for that help. I'm not sure. But it is really interesting to me that there's, such a big space here. So anyhow, like I said, for me, my goal today is really just to provide you with some clarity and direction, no matter where you are in your planning journey. So let's kind of jump in. So today's agenda, there's really two main topics that we're going to focus on. The first is building your team, and then the second is developing your special needs plan. So as we're thinking about developing that plan, there's really, I would say, 5 steps really to building this out. The first is understanding your current situation and your vision for the future. The second is getting the benefits your loved one's going to be entitled to. We are going to spend some time digging into SSI, SSDI, and how those benefits kind of work. So we're going to spend some time on that today. Attempting to estimate your future cost of care. We're going to jump into that a little bit. And then establishing a special needs trust, right? Understanding, does that make sense for your family? How does it work? And then how would we logistically implement something like that into your plan? And then I would say if I was going to add one more bullet to this, it would be ABLE accounts. We are going to spend a little bit of time on ABLEs. Quickly though, before I jump into the meat of this, just a quick housekeeping item. If you do have questions, because I can see we have somewhat of a smaller group today, which I actually prefer. So if you have questions as I'm going through this, I would love it if you could put them into the chat. And then Stephanie will just yell them to me as we're going, and we'll make sure that I can hopefully answer your questions in real time. But let's jump in. Okay, so building your team. So I believe that you are going to need to engage with 3, possibly even 4 professionals throughout your journey. A financial professional, someone like myself, a government benefits specialist, and an attorney. And when you work with an attorney, hopefully it's someone who has some experience in setting up special needs trust or elder law, right? You want to make sure that that's kind of their focus. And then the 4th person that you might want to engage with would be a CPA. Because as a special needs family, there are certain things that we may be able to deduct that maybe our neighbors, being that they're not in our same situation, may not have those same deduction opportunities. So we just want to make sure that we're taking advantage of any tax advantage that we can get. But let's kind of dig in a little bit more on these particular professionals, on what their role would be and kind of how that would fit into your planning. So we'll start with the attorney. The attorney is usually going to come into the picture at the point that you engage with them, right? And so usually that's going to be at the time when you want to get some estate planning done, whether that's wills, setting up a special needs trust, or just general trust planning. Perhaps it's around the time your child turns 18, if we think guardianship or conservatorship is the route that we need to go. But that's the person who's going to come in and really help you draft those legal documents that you're going to need, to put those things in place to provide that support down the road. This is typically not an ongoing relationship. So when you engage with the attorney, you pay them a fee, they provide you with the document, and then that's usually it, right? They're gonna exit the relationship at that point. One thing I would suggest is if you've already done some estate planning, I would just put it on your radar to review those documents or have them reviewed at least every 5 years. And the reason we say that is because things have a way of changing over time. And if you've done this, you might know that there are several roles that you will need to designate, right? You're going to need to choose a trustee or a successor guardian or an executor, right? There's these roles that we have to put in place with estate planning. And what made sense 5 years ago might make no sense at all today. And so I do just usually recommend that every 5 years, you just get an eye on that just to remember how you set things up, just to make sure it's still relevant. And then that way you can be on top of making those changes. Um, I've seen a handful of times where people have set their things up, 20 plus years ago, and the people that they designated, none of them are alive, right? And so that's not a very strong document. That would cause a lot of issues, right? If we didn't make any adjustments to that. So just staying on top of that, I think every 5 years is a good rule of thumb. But let's talk about the financial professional. So one of the things you might notice in this picture here is that there are arrows that are kind of connecting the special needs planner, or excuse me, the financial professional with the attorney and the government benefits specialist. And the reason why is because oftentimes the financial planner is going to be kind of like the quarterback and kind of bringing those people in as needed. So this typically is the relationship that would be ongoing, where you have maybe you're meeting annually or even more often than that to update and review things. And they're going to be pulling these professionals in as needed. Now, when it comes to what the financial professional will do for you, I can't speak to every financial planner, what they will provide, but I'm fairly certain that most of them can help you with the protection and growth part of financial planning. Those would be things like what you would probably think of, right, in working with a financial planner, setting up retirement accounts or tracking funding for college and paying down debt and those kind of things, right? Um, Life insurance, right? Those kind of things. But if you're on this call today, you are also going to need another layer of that, another additional type of planning, which is legacy planning, right? Because for most of us in this world, we have to have a plan in place for if we are no longer here. What's going to transfer to our children that will help benefit them while we're gone, right? And if we can be intentional about that, how does that look? So today, I think I'll focus on trust funding as a piece that I think is definitely something to think about. So I think one of the things we do really well is helping our clients estimate the future cost of care that their child might need throughout their lifetime. Um, I think having a special needs trust is absolutely important, and hopefully by the end of today's session, you'll understand why. But having a funding strategy is equally as important, right? We want to know exactly down to the penny how much should go into this trust to make sure our child can live, the life that we would want them to have. And then where is that going to come from? What assets are going to be used to fund that, right? And I will say that you can be very intentional with that. I see this all the time where maybe there's multiple children, right? So like for me, for an example, I have two boys. One of them is typically developing, one of them is not, right? So if my plan was we're just going to leave everything down the middle 50-50, that feels good in theory. But when you really look at it on paper, what my typically developing son would inherit would actually look very different than what my son would inherit in his special needs trust simply because of the taxes. So as you're working with a financial planner, they can really help you be intentional about maybe picking and choosing what asset you would want to leave to the trust, and maybe assets that we don't want to leave to the trust if we have another alternative because they're not going to be very tax advantageous. So the other piece in legacy planning would be estate equalization. this is where, like, again, my example, I have two children, right? One of them is typically developing, one is not. So when we think about how we want to distribute the estate, what's fair might not be equitable, right? Because at some point, we're hoping our oldest son is going to be self-sufficient. He'll be kind of on his own, doing his own thing, and won't need as much support from us. We're not so sure what that's going to look like for our youngest son. So what he might need might be a larger amount than what the other kiddo might need. So just making sure that we have a very intentional strategy for equalizing the estate and funding that trust. Hopefully that was helpful. Again, that's the ongoing relationship. Now, a government benefits specialist, typically this person would come into the picture at the point that you're ready to apply for benefits, usually around the age of 18, if not maybe sooner, but SSI is usually the driver for having those kind of conversations. And I can tell you that you don't necessarily need a government benefits specialist, but if you haven't applied for benefits yet, just know that there are professionals that can help you through that process that will literally help you fill out the forms, submit them, and then keep up with them, right? Because what I'm hearing is, the first thing you'll do is submit an application, and then they'll want to do an interview with your child for SSI in particular. And for some people, it can take months and months and months for them to even get the call back to schedule the interview, right? And so what that means is that us as parents would have to call every so often to make sure that we're staying on top of that thing or on top of that process to keep that ball moving. But if you have a government benefits specialist, they're going to do that for you. They're going to keep that ball rolling and make sure that we get the result we're wanting as soon as possible. Again, this is not typically an ongoing relationship. We would normally engage with the government benefits specialist at the point in time we're ready to start applying for benefits. Or sometimes, like, for instance, maybe we applied for SSI and we got denied and we're not sure why. That might be a reason why we would bring them in, but they usually provide the service and then leave the relationship. I guess at this point, maybe I should take a moment and just ask if there are any questions. The other piece I'll say while maybe someone's typing in a question is that box there at the bottom that says other professionals and resources. This is, doctors, teachers, therapists. I find that in the community, it's very easy to find a great recommendation for a doctor or a therapist, right? Like, I feel like in the community, people have a really good pulse on who are the good, ABA clinics or whatever, right? And so I feel like it's a little harder to actually find a great attorney or a great financial planner in the special needs world or a great government benefit specialist. So if you need a recommendation, please let me know. I'm happy to provide you with a recommendation. Okay, I do see we have a question here.
We do have a question.
Okay.
It says, pertaining to the advice that you're giving for military families, does this change across state lines?
So this advice, not necessarily. So what I will say, I guess maybe thinking about the legal documents, it is typically recommended that you redo your will and trust if you do move from one state to the next. Most states have what they call reciprocal language in there, where another state should accept it. But it is generally advised that if you move from one state to the other, that you update those estate documents. Now, when it comes to the government benefits, that, some of those programs are going to be state specific, particularly Medicaid, right? All the Medicaid waivers, those are going to be state specific. But, the typical benefits like SSI or SSDI, those are really more on the federal level. So those won't change much from state to state. It would be more of the local programs. But that is another example of why I would, like, if I have a client who's moving from one state to another, we usually will bring in a government benefits specialist to help try to mimic whatever benefits we already had set up in one state, if we can try to get the same thing set up in the next state. Hopefully that answered that question. Okay, well, I'll move on. If you have many more questions, please drop them in the chat. All right. Okay, let's talk about SSI. So I feel like government benefits are the area where we get a lot of questions. So I'm going to do my best to answer these before you guys have a chance to ask them, and we'll see how I do. But SSI, or supplemental security income. So if your child is under the age of 18, let me actually draw your attention to the bottom half of the page here. So if your child's under the age of 18, SSA is going to look at parents' income and assets, as well as the overall household size, as they're trying to determine the child's eligibility. So to keep it kind of like high level for today, it's actually kind of hard to qualify for SSI when your child is a minor, particularly if you have a dual income household, right? If you have two people in the household working and we're making more than $3,000 a month, it's very unlikely we're going to qualify for benefits. Again, if we're kind of on that line, that would be a reason I would suggest bringing in a government benefits specialist. They can kind of help counsel you on what income we need to like write what the exact line is and that kind of thing. But you know, the rules change when the child turns 18 and it really opens up. So at that point, they're no longer going to look at mom and dad's income and assets to determine eligibility. They're just going to look at your child's income and assets. So one of the things that maybe I want to try to drill into your brain is the asset limitation. So we can't have more than $2,000 in our child's name at the point, or really at any point, but certainly when you apply for SSI, otherwise they won't be approved, right? Can't have more than $2,000. Additionally, there is an income limitation as well. The updated numbers for 2025 are showing that if they have an income of $1,950 or less, then they could qualify for a full SSI benefit. But if they're above that, then it would either be a reduced benefit or they wouldn't qualify based on income, right? So those are two of the parameters there. One thing I'll just mention is that asset limitation has been the same for many, many years. That has not changed. It's a very low number. The income number does tend to fluctuate a little bit and keep up with inflation, but as of today, $2,000 is that limit, right? So where I see this becoming an issue for some people is, you know, mom and dad did a great thing. They set up a little kiddo savings account at the local bank, and they've been putting birthday money and holiday money in there and chores and whatever else, right? Or mom and dad are just putting money in there on a monthly basis, and they've got a good chunk of change in there. And the idea is this is for our kids' future. It's a beautiful thing. SSI doesn't like that. They don't want it to be in the kid's name. So I would just say if you have anything you think might be an issue before you apply for this benefit, definitely reach out to a financial planner and they can talk to you about maybe restructuring that in a way that would be then not considered a countable asset. But as of 2025, the maximum SSI benefit is $967 a month. That is the income portion that would be coming in, right? And then if the child is not already receiving Medicaid health benefits, then they would automatically be eligible for that program as well. So it's usually a tandem thing where there's an income and then there's also a health benefit attached to it. Let's see. Any questions on SSI? I'm wondering if there's anyone that's getting close to applying.
We do have one question.
Okay.
It says, I have no idea how to even find the attorney, financial professional, or government benefit specialist. How do I find someone?
Yes, oh my gosh, great question. So I can definitely help you with that. At the end of the presentation, I am going to put my email address up on the screen. I could probably type it in. Well, no, the chat is anonymous, so you wouldn't be able to see it. But send me an email, and I'm happy to make some introductions. I have attorneys in all 50 states that are in the special needs world. They've all been vetted. So if you need, it doesn't matter where you live, I can definitely point you in the right direction for any one of those. Great question. Anything about SSI so far? I could go on and on about it and like some tips and tricks on how to make sure you can maximize the benefit, but I don't want to, if we don't have anyone on the call that's close to that, I don't necessarily want to waste our time on that. So I don't know. I guess I'll move on. We'll move on and we'll talk about SSDI. So this is a benefit that actually a lot of families don't know much about. Usually there's at least one person in these presentations. It's like, wow, I never even knew that that was a thing. But the way that this one works is our kiddos will be eligible for this benefit if our child has a documented diagnosis of their disability prior to age 22. So we have to have something medically documented, right? But if so, if we have that, then at the point that we start drawing Social Security in our own retirement, our child is going to be eligible for a benefit on top of that, equal to half of our benefit. So I'll give you an example. Let's say that I'm in retirement and my Social Security benefit is $3,000 a month. So that would mean my son would be eligible for $1,500. I just saw a question come in, even if they do not live with us. Yes, it doesn't matter if they live with you or not. If you are still considered a legal parent, then they can draw on your Social Security record. Now, a question that I get asked a lot is, okay, can they draw off of mom and dad's record? And the answer is no. You can only draw off of one parent record at a time, but it isn't unusual to start on one parent record and then maybe jump over to the other parent record. Like for an example, let's say we have maybe an age gap between mom and dad, and we have one parent that's retiring significantly earlier than the other. We might start on that parent's record. And then once parent number 2 retires, if that benefit would be higher, then we might jump over to parent number 2, but we can't be on both at the same time. Another question I get asked a lot is, how long does that benefit last, right? Like what happens when we die? So they can keep it at the 50% level as long as we're alive, and then it actually jumps up to 75% at the point we pass away as parents, and they're able to maintain that for the rest of their lifetime.
We do have a quick question.
Sure.
One of our participants is in California and they have Medi-Cal. What is the difference between Medi-Cal and Medicaid?
Medi-Cal is just California's version of Medicaid. It's the same thing. Yeah, great question. Same thing. So that leads me to another thought. One of the things that we get asked a lot is, do these benefits stack, right? Can I get SSI and SSDI, which is what this benefit is essentially called, SSDI? Can we get them at the same time? And the answer is maybe, but probably not, right? So let me give you an example where we would have a dual benefit. Let's say that my retirement benefit is $1,000 a month. So that would mean my son would be getting an SSDI benefit of 500, right? Because he gets half of mine. So in that example, he would get a dual benefit. He would get some SSI on top of the SSDI, but if the SSDI benefit is more than the 967, then the SSI is going to fall away, right? So that is, one thing that I think is really interesting is that, and again, why we might want to have a government benefit specialist come in and make sure we're kind of maximizing that. But okay, so if we're on the assumption that SSI is going to fall away, then sometimes people will ask, well, what happens to Medicaid, right? Or for whoever lives in California, Medi-Cal. So there's this 2-year window of time where we're no longer on SSI, but we get to keep Medicaid. And then after that 2-year window, then the child should automatically flip over to Medicare insurance, right? Medicare. Which I've been told is actually kind of a good thing, because oftentimes providers prefer Medicare insurance over Medicaid. Sorry, I'm making sure I'm saying those words correctly. So it just kind of opens up the world a little bit when it comes to providers. Okay, I think I saw another question pop in.
We do. So there's a question about what qualifies as a qualifying disability for Social Security. So is there certain conditions that are excluded from that qualification? Are there
Yeah,
ones that are more highly
yeah, great
not
question.
desired, but yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll let you go.
Yeah, I think I understand. So there are some diagnoses that are going to be an automatic approval, right? There's gonna, for instance, if it's autism, there's also going to be like an IQ test involved. So there's going to have to be some assessments done to figure out if SSA is going to consider them disabled or not. But there are some mental health disorders that would be considered for that. So it really kind of depends. Um, I know SSA has a great description on their website, and if we have time at the end, I can pull that up and give you the exact wording. But if we're on the line, right, if we're not sure, again, that's when I always bring in the government benefits specialist, because they can really help you determine what you need to do to get it approved, right? Maybe we need to get a new assessment or get an updated IQ assessment done, or maybe we need to provide some additional medical records to get that approval. So I can say in my, time serving the special needs community, I've never had someone who thought they should get benefits not get benefits. So I'll just say that. Let me think if there's anything about SSDI. Let me think. Let me kick it over to you guys. Are there any other questions for you all about SSI or SSDI, how they work? No. One other thing I'll say, so as you're working towards your own, for instance, retirement goals, one of the big questions is, when should we start drawing Social Security, right, in retirement? That's a big discussion, especially in the in the financial planning community. As a financial planner, we do a lot of counseling on that. Should we defer that benefit? Should we take it now? So one of the things I can tell you is every year we defer our own benefit, that benefit grows by 8%, which is great, right? If I told you you're going to get an 8% raise every year, you'd probably be pretty pumped about that. But what I think a lot of people don't know is that calculation that we talked about, that our child's benefit is attached to, that's going to be based on our full retirement age calculation, regardless of when we take our benefit, right? So 67 is when most of us are going to be eligible for our full retirement benefit. So if we draw at age 62, our kiddos' benefit's still going to be calculated based on if we would have deferred to 67. Now then, if we defer to 70, their benefit's still going to be based on what we would have drawn if we would have drawn earlier at 67. So there are, oh yeah, I'm so glad Mary mentioned this. Thank you, Mary. I'm gonna talk about that in just a second. I lost my thought. That's what happens. That's what happens when we get good questions. But let me just touch on that really quick. So Mary said that her child turned 18 last February, and they applied for SSI in March, which is exactly what you should do when you apply. It's recommended to apply the month following the month of the birthday. And it was November before they actually heard anything back. Yes, I'm hearing that the wait as of right now is anywhere between 9 to 12 months, right? So that's very common. I'm so glad you brought that up. So what happens though, like let's say you applied and it was, a year before you got an approval, they're going to retroactively pay you back from the date you submitted the application. And so it's kind of common actually for that first check to be big, right? Like $10,000 sometimes. And in the same time, they're telling you really shouldn't have more than $2,000. So we're going to talk about some strategies on how we can kind of maneuver in those examples, but just to help manage expectations, when you apply, it's a very long wait, oftentimes almost a year. So thank you for bringing that up, Mary. Really great point. Any other thoughts or questions on government benefits? No? Okay, let's move on then. So let's talk about developing your special needs plan. Hopefully, the couple of slides before helped you understand that there are some really valuable benefits that are out there, right? That we can get that are going to help support monetarily, but also with health benefits. So we want to make sure that we are protecting those and we're staying eligible and in compliance for those programs. And there's lots of ways to mess it up. But as you're beginning to build out your special needs plan, I would encourage you to really start by understanding your current situation and then your vision for the future. So I talk about this all the time, that I feel like this might be true for any parent, but I feel like if you're in our world, maybe even to the next level, we're often just kind of surviving the day, right? Like I'll speak for myself, but I, fly out of bed. It's to get kids ready, get them off to school, work, pick them up, go to therapies. Then there's sports and other things for the other kid. And then we're trying to get food on the table and bathed and homework. And then it's like, get them in bed and do it all over again the next day. So I understand surviving the day, right? We're trying to get through it. But I would encourage you, if you haven't done it already, to maybe set some time aside and really think about what your vision is, right? Because if we can have a clear vision of what we're working towards, we're going to have a better chance of actually hitting that goal. And then as you're thinking about financially planning, right? You want to make sure that you're really kind of thinking about yourself first, which I feel like as a parent goes against our DNA, right? I think when we have kids, something changes in our DNA and everything becomes about them. But when it comes to financial planning, we have to make sure that we have our needs met too, right? Because if we're just planning for our child in a vacuum and something falls apart outside of that, it's all gonna fall apart, right? So as you're thinking about yourself and your planning, do you have an idea of what your saving and spending habits are? Are you tracking that? It's okay if you're not, most people aren't. But that would be a good place to start, really kind of get a handle of what's coming in on a monthly basis and what's going out. And then what are your short, medium, and long-term goals for yourself, right? Is it maybe to pay off debt or to expand your business, or maybe it's retire someday or send kids to college or buy a second home or whatever it is, right? But what are some things you're really working towards? And then what are your dreams for the future? When you think about retirement, what does that look like for you? Do you see yourself traveling or um, maybe downsizing and volunteering or, playing golf, whatever that is? But what do you ideally want retirement to look like for you? And then as you're thinking about your loved one, it's going to be very important as you're building out their plan to really think about your vision for their future, right? Where will they live? Do you see them living with you indefinitely? Or do you want them to live as independently as they're able to do? Maybe with some support, right? And then who's going to provide that day-to-day care needed? Obviously, it'll be us as long as we can as parents, but when we can't do it anymore, do we have an idea of who might be able to step into that role? And then what social activities will he or she participate in? I think that's really important because as much as it's, our job to keep our kids safe, we want to make sure that they're happy too. And so if we can build in something into the plan that really brings up that quality of life for them, we definitely want to do that. So I'll give you an example. We have a client where mom is actually a single mom, and her daughter, I guess, is probably around 20 now. They have an RV and they drive from Texas to Florida at least 6 times a year to go to Disney. And that is their thing. They love it. It's like, that's their jam. And it was really important to mom as we were sitting down and doing her planning that, if she were no longer in the picture, that her daughter would still have the ability to take those trips. Obviously, it would be with a caregiver. We would have to hire some support to come in and do that. But it was really important to mom that her daughter be able to continue that because she just loved it so much. So that's just kind of an example there. But as we're kind of moving on into the nuts and bolts of building out that special needs plan, one of the big components is going to be incorporating a special needs trust. So if you aren't super familiar with what these are, how they work, it's essentially a legal document that you would get through the attorney that is almost like you're creating a new entity, right? It's almost kind of like in a way, you're almost like opening up a business, right? Kind of. But it's its own entity. So when you set this up, it's going to have its own name. It'll have its own tax ID number, and it'll also have its own birthday, believe it or not, the date that it's executed, right? But the idea is whatever asset we want to leave to our child when we're no longer here, we want to leave it to the trust. So instead of naming our child's name, we're going to write the trust name. And the trust then owns this asset. Now, the beneficiary of the trust would be our children, right? We get to decide who the beneficiary is. So they're the only person that can really benefit from anything that lives inside the trust, but they don't own it outright. And so that is the way that we can, leave the money and not disqualify ourselves from those valuable government benefits that we just talked about. I guess let me pause there. Are there any questions about special needs trust, kind of how they work? I guess as I'm giving time for maybe someone to type one in, I will say logistically, more times than not, the way that it's structured is that the trust is written into the will, and the trust doesn't actually get created until mom and dad pass away, right? Or maybe the trust document's already created, but there's like a $10 bill stapled to it or something like that. I've seen all kind of different ways to do it, but generally speaking, we don't leave, big assets inside the trust now while mom and dad are still alive. It's usually recommended that we keep control over those assets, right? We hold on to them so that we can control them while we're still alive. But at the point we're ready to pass that on when we're gone, that's when we leave it to the trust. And that's when the trust kind of comes alive.
We do have
Hopefully
a
that makes
question.
sense. Yeah.
We do have a question. What happens to the money in the special needs trust once the child passes?
Love this question. So it's almost like I paid you to ask it. Okay, so there's actually two types of special needs trust. Sometimes they're called supplemental needs trust. Those words are used interchangeably, but it's third party and first party. So let's start with third party. Third party means that someone other than the child owned the asset that went into the trust, right? So mom and dad owned it. They left it to the trust directly. That's third party money. Maybe it was grandma and grandpa or aunt and uncle or neighbor, whoever it is, but it was someone other than the child. So if we have a third party special needs trust and the child passes away, we get to control where those remaining assets go. So we can leave them to another family member. We can even leave them to a charity of our choice if we want to. But that's only third party. So let's talk about first party. First party means that the child owned the asset and then it was put into the trust. So I have a great example of that. I have a client we are working with where it was actually grandma and grandpa who were caring for this adult woman who had Down syndrome. And they did phenomenal planning. They did great planning. They had a beautiful special needs trust and they did 99% of it right. There was this one account that they forgot to update beneficiaries on, and it had about $100,000 in it. And so the young woman with Down syndrome, she inherited this $100,000 and she got disqualified from some benefits. And so what her trustee did is they went to an attorney and the attorney drafted up a first party special needs trust. They were able to get the 100,000 over there. She was back in business for government benefits. But now that is considered her money, right? And so if she passes away with anything left in that first party trust, Medicaid has rights to it and they can take it. Now, depending on what state you're in, there are some states that waive that tell you that they're not going to go after first party money or able money. I would just say that maybe think that it is at least a possibility that they will, because I feel like that would be one way that they could easily, change a waiver and make more money for the state if they needed to. So, but there are the vast majority of states, if it's first party, Medicaid's going to take it. Great question. It was a long answer to your really good question, but hopefully that brought some clarity. Okay, I'm going to move on. Let's talk about some of the roles that you'll need to designate as you're setting up the special needs trust. So you may have heard guardian, trustee, executor. Sometimes I think people get those words kind of confused or maybe think that they're all the same thing. They're actually three separate roles. When you think of an executor, that is the person that is going to be in charge of making sure that the will is executed according to the document, right? So if we wrote in our will that we want our classic car collection to go to Aunt Penny, then the executor is going to make sure that those cars make it to Aunt Penny, right? So that's their job, is to make sure that the will is executed. A guardian, now that would be a person who would step in and make decisions for our child, basically for their well-being. So where they live, medical decisions, right? Those kind of things, that's what they would be in charge of. They're in charge of the person. The trustee is the person or entity that's in charge of managing the trust. So any assets that live inside of there, they would be in charge of, how they might be invested or what asset is being liquidated. In addition to that, they're in charge of a lot of administrative things like paying taxes, paying bills, right? So the trustee role is actually, believe it or not, a very big responsibility because not only do we need to make sure this person has some, maybe investment savviness, but also we need to make sure that they understand the rules of staying in compliance for government benefits. Because if they don't understand how that works, there could be some mistakes there. But there are options, right? When you're thinking about who you want to name as a trustee, you could certainly go with a family member or a close friend. Very common arrangement. Oftentimes we see a sibling if we're talking about an adult child already. But you can also choose a co-trustee relationship. So this means there would be more than one person, right? So this arrangement, from what I hear from attorneys, is the least favorite in the attorney world because it does kind of open up the opportunity for there to be conflict because the way this one works is both parties have to agree before anything can happen, right? So if someone comes in and says, you know what, I really think we need to buy a Ferrari, that feels right, and I think it's necessary, the other party would have to say, yep, I agree, before that could happen. Hopefully the other party is going to say, no, I don't think we need a Ferrari. Maybe like a minivan or something else would be more appropriate. But regardless, there would be some checks and balances there. We'd have to have both parties on the same page. But then you can also choose a corporate trustee. So candidly, that's how my husband and I set up ours. We chose a corporate trustee. And the reason why we did that is because when we really looked at our family, I didn't feel like there was anyone on either side of our families that had the capacity to handle that large of a role. We have lots of people in our family that I think would be wonderful caregivers and guardians. But that task of overseeing the trust and staying on top of regulations and things, I just felt like there wasn't anyone who had, not that they weren't able to do it, it's just they didn't really have the time to do it. So a corporate trustee, if you're wondering what that is, it's essentially a bank or a trust company. And that's what these people do for their job. They have to stay up on regulations. They're going to be, there's just far less mistakes, I think, when you have a corporate trustee. There is a fee for that. So sometimes people don't love that about it because you do have to pay, right, for this oversight and management. But I just like mentioning that because I do, more often than not, I have families tell me, we just don't have anyone that I feel like could handle that role. And so I just want to let you know there are options out there. If you have more questions about corporate trustees, or if you would like for me to point you in the direction of a couple of really good ones, I'm happy to make some introductions for that as well. Just let me know. Are there any other questions before we move on from trustees? Nope. Okay. I'm going to keep going, but you type it in if you think of it. Let's talk about ABLE plans. We often get a lot of questions about ABLE. So if you've never heard of an ABLE account, that's okay. They've only been around for about 10 years, so they're fairly new. But when they were created, Congress authorized each specific state to create a tax-free savings account specifically for individuals who have special needs. So you have to have an actual disability diagnosis to be eligible for one of these accounts and or be considered disabled through SSA, right? Their definition. But assuming we have that, then we can set this account up and we can put money aside and it won't actually count against them when it comes to SSI or Medicaid. Because remember, I told you we can't have more than $2,000. That is true unless it's in a special needs trust or if it's in an ABLE account. And then we can have more than that, right? But as of right now, the maximum we can have in the ABLE account and still be a non-countable asset is 100,000. Can't have more than 100. The next slide kind of talks about what we can use an ABLE account for. So the definition basically says you can use an ABLE account for anything that's going to create a better life experience for your child. So it's a very broad definition. I can't really think of anything that we couldn't make a good argument for, right, for using the fund. So it's very open. You may notice that I highlighted housing on here. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a moment, but I did want to just have you mentally kind of check mark that in your brain, that the ABLE account actually can be used for housing. But this slide right here is actually my favorite slide of the whole presentation. This shows you side by side how an ABLE account and a special needs trust, how they work side by side. So let's kind of walk through it. So in an ABLE account, in terms of eligibility, we have to have that disability diagnosis prior to age 26. But assuming we have that, we are eligible. In a special needs trust, for if it's a third party, there actually is no age limitation. So it doesn't matter when the disability happened, or even if technically we have a documented disability, we can still have a special needs trust. In terms of setup, an ABLE account is very easy to set up. You would actually do that kind of on your own. In fact, one of the tools that we are going to send you guys at the end of the presentation is the ABLE Analyzer tool, where depending on what state you are in, you can look up your ABLE program and compare it to other ABLE programs as well. So one thing I'll just say is if you are residing in a state that has a state income tax, I would 100% recommend you open your state ABLE program because you'll get a deduction for any contributions you make. If you happen to live in a state that doesn't have a state income tax, then it really doesn't matter what state ABLE program you choose. I'm here in Texas. We don't have a state income tax, and I can tell you candidly, Texas ABLE program is not the best. So we don't have the ABLE in Texas. But when it comes to a special needs trust, when you're setting that up, you would need to go through an attorney. I wouldn't recommend trying to do that on your own. Definitely have a professional help you draft that. In terms of contribution limits, so in an ABLE account, the maximum we can put in each year is 19,000, and that's total. We can't have more than 19,000 per calendar year into the account. Now, when it comes to a special needs trust, there's no limit. We can put as much as we want in there. No one's tracking that. Again, the maximum account balance in an ABLE is 100,000. If we go above that, then it would be considered a countable asset for SSI and Medicaid. So we just want to keep it below. In a special needs trust, though, there is no maximum. We can put $19 million if we want in there. That's perfectly fine. In an ABLE account, in terms of uses, it does have a wide range of uses, including housing without affecting SSI. So this is that point I was mentioning before. So technically, if we have a child who's on SSI and we are supplementing their housing costs from any source, then SSA is going to consider that. I think they call it in-kind support or something like that, and they're going to reduce the SSI benefit by 1/3. So that can sometimes be an issue, right? Because remember, SSI pays $967 a month. I don't care where you live in the United States, we can't get very far on that, right? When it comes to housing. So it's not uncommon for a parent to need to help supplement that, or, especially when someone's living off of a trust that's already been funded, that we're using trust funds to help supplement housing. But again, if we're receiving that SSI benefit, then SSI is going to be reduced by 1/3 unless we're using an ABLE account to pay for housing. Then there's not going to be an issue. So one of the kind of workarounds to that example would be if we already have this trust situated, we can actually take a distribution from the trust of that 19,000 for the year, put it into the ABLE account, and now we've freed that money up and we can use it to help offset housing without affecting SSI. So we'd still get that full 967 a month. Kind of a complicated, weird issue there, but I think that's just one thing I like to mention. If we are going to need to supplement housing and we're on SSI, you definitely want to have an ABLE account. Okay, special needs trust, wide range of uses, but cannot be used for necessities like housing if you're receiving SSI. I should probably update this slide to say should not instead of cannot. It can technically be used to pay for housing, but then we would just have that reduction in benefit. Okay, in terms of taxability in an ABLE account, the distributions would be tax-free. We love a tax-free anything, right? In a special needs trust, though, to keep it simple, we don't get any tax favors at all. So if we were going to have a taxable event, we're going to have a taxable event. So I'll give you an example. Let's say that we left a 401k, an old 401k of ours to the trust. So what's going to happen is that 401k is going to have what's called a required minimum distribution. So the IRS is going to say, based on our child's life expectancy, we have to take out X amount. And that's going to be considered income, right? And so that's going to create a taxable event. Now, not to get too in the weeds here, but I will just say that trusts have accelerated tax rates. So if we have a trust that's retaining more than roughly $16,000 of income per year, $16,000 per year, then we're going to be taxed at 37%, which is huge, right? To say the same thing about any of us on the call, for us to be in the 37% tax bracket, we would need to be making upwards of 600,000 or more of income to be taxed at 37%. So that's why kind of at the beginning of the presentation, I said you really want to work with a financial planner to help you figure out what asset is going to be efficient inside that trust versus maybe we leave that to someone else that's going to be a little bit more efficient. Okay, remaining assets. So anything that's left in the ABLE account may go back to Medicaid. So again, depending on what state you're in, there are some states that waive that clawback provision. I would just tell you, I think it's just a good rule of thumb to assume that it's probably going to be taken back. Because like I said, that rule could change at any time. I think that's a really easy thing for a state to change and help the bottom line. So yeah, I would just assume that that's probably going to happen. So very similar to that first party trust, right, that we talked about. Now then, if it's a third party special needs trust, then Medicaid has no rights to it because that money was never the child's. They never owned it, right? So we can maintain control and we can pass that on to family members or like I mentioned, even a charity of your choice. Okay, last but not least, ease of access. So an ABLE account oftentimes will come with a debit card, so you can use it right at the point of purchase, right? So I think this is a really great way to help create some independence for our child. Let's say that, they want to have a day out with their friends. They want to go to the movies. Then you can actually send them to the movies with their debit card. They can use it right there to pay for the movie, to pay for concessions, whatever they want to do. And that's a way for them to access their own money right then and there. A special needs trust is very different, right? So the whole thing that makes a special needs trust compliant for government benefits is that the verbiage states that we can never take money from the trust and give it directly to the beneficiary. They can't ever have, we can't ever say, here's $5,000, go have fun with that. That can never happen. So if we have a special needs trust, what will happen is the trustee will be in charge of paying things directly, right? So I give this silly example, like let's go with the Disney example. Let's say we want to take a trip to Disney. If we have this trust, what's going to have to happen is the trust is going to pay for the flight to Disney directly. They're going to pay for the hotel directly. They're going to pay for tea with the princesses directly, right? They're going to pay for all of these things specifically from the trust to the point of purchase. It'll never flow through our kiddos' hands. But let's say in that same trip, we want to let them have a little bit of freedom, and maybe they want to buy something at, a stuffed animal or something at one of the little stores that they have at Disney. Well, then that would be an example of where you would bring the Able debit card and let them use that, right? So um, hopefully that gives a little clarity of how we're able to access the funds. Let me take a quick pause. Any questions about Able accounts or special needs trust, kind of how they compare or contrast?
There was a question about, and the asker did note that if it's too political or too controversial, then no
Oh,
need to answer, but it relates
okay.
to these types of accounts. Are they secure given the recent concerns regarding Social Security?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And there has been a lot of, I would say, concern about that. And so all I can tell you is I don't know, right? All I know is what we know today. And I do think that there are a lot of changes happening right now, and it is possible that some of these programs could change. I don't think they'll go away entirely. I do know for a fact that just in general, Social Security is going to need to change. I don't know if you've ever looked at your personal Social Security statement, but there is actually a disclaimer on there that basically says at the rate that we're spending, Social Security is going to be out of money in like 2030 something. So not long from now. So I do believe that the benefits will probably change. I don't think they're going to go away entirely, but I could be wrong. I honestly don't know. I like to joke that my name's Crystal. I don't have a crystal ball. But one of the things that we do with our clients is, we do plan for today and then we adjust for the future. And when we do plan with these benefits, we assume a very conservative number. So, for instance, when I'm doing a financial plan for a client, whatever the benefit says it's supposed to be in Social Security, we reduce that in half. That's what we actually plan for, is half of whatever's stated. So, I feel comfortable with that, but, who knows, right? And I think that's a very valid question. So thank you for asking it. I think if anything, what that probably pushes me to kind of believe and think for my own planning is that we don't really have a lot of control over these programs, right? And so I think doing planning sooner rather than later, and maybe assuming that we aren't going to have as much support from the government probably makes a lot of sense, that we might need to take a lot of that planning on ourselves and do it sooner rather than later. Great question, though. Any other questions? No? Okay. Just a quick recap. So I do think you need a team. I love a DIYer. My husband loves all these DIY projects at home, but I do believe that this is something you would want to lean on experts for. Remember, there's the financial professional. I would love to help you. Again, we work with clients all across the country. If you have questions, please use me as a resource. If you need a government benefits specialist, happy to make that recommendation. Same for an attorney. And then as you're developing your special needs plan, remember there's those 4 key points. Understanding your current situation and your vision for the future, that's something that you'll kind of have to think through. Getting the benefits your loved one is entitled to, government benefits specialists can help you with that. Attempting to estimate the future cost of care, that's where we come in. The financial planners, we can help you really get a feel for how much should actually go into the trust and where's it going to come from. But not only that, what's the plan to help fund these needs even while we're still alive, right? Even into retirement, where's this going to come from? And then last but not least, establishing and funding your special needs trust. That's where the attorney comes in. And then just a few final considerations. So I do think, you want to do the planning ahead of time. Um, we don't want to kick that can down the road and end up not doing it and then put our family in a situation where they have to set up that first party trust, right? Because number one, it's expensive. It requires a court hearing. And it's an administrative nightmare because anytime we want to pull money out, sometimes it also requires a court hearing. So it's just not ideal. Um, and Medicaid's going to take it if there's anything left in there. So we want to make sure we're doing the planning ahead of time. I do suggest including your entire family, especially if you are planning on listing any of them on some of those roles, right? If we want them to be a future guardian or a trustee or an executor, have them involved in the conversation. And then your special needs plan does need to be part of your overall financial plan. I would not recommend just looking at one piece and not the others. It really has to be integrated. And then when you're looking for a financial advisor, just make sure it's someone who is going to help you on the implementation. I think most of them will help you identify your goals and develop a great plan, but a lot of planners actually don't help you on the implementation and then the ongoing reviews, right? You want to make sure that you continue to meet with them at least once a year and update the plan as needed. I'm going to skip that one for the sake of time, but where do we go from here? So we are offering anyone on today's session a comprehensive financial plan that includes that quality of life estimate for your loved one at no cost. So we've waived the planning fee if you're on the call today. Like I said, I think that brings a lot of clarity to how much should go into the trust, and then where's it going to come from on top of, where are you tracking for retirement or any other goal that you may have. And then we are also going to send you also tools regardless if you want to do the planning or not. There's 4 main pieces. The first, the special needs planning checklist. This is a really good piece just to kind of keep and have handy that maybe will give you some things to think about. Again, no matter where you are in your planning process. So if you're like, I really feel like we have everything, I would still give this a look just to make sure you're not missing any pieces. The other thing we're going to send you is what's called the letter of intent. This is a really amazing document where you can put down everything that's very unique and special about your child. Like who are their doctors? What medications do they take? Do they have any allergies, right? All of the little things that are important. Because what I found is there tends to be one caregiver in the household who's kind of more on top of that than the other. In my household, it's me. My husband's amazing, but if I were to call him and say, hey, can you set up an appointment with our son's neurologist, he would not know where to call. He wouldn't know what to do. So this would be a really, I think, valuable document for my husband if I were to just disappear overnight, because he would have everything he needs in one spot, right? And I do recommend that you fill that out, update it regularly, and keep it with your estate plan. So keep it with your will and your special needs trust. I've often seen where like that letter of intent is really heavily relied upon when it comes to what a trustee can or can't use funds for, right? So you can really be very specific. Like for instance, if we have someone, I'm just thinking one person where they were doing a lot of alternative medicine, stuff that's not covered by insurance, and it was expensive. And thankfully they had kind of that listed in their letter of intent. And so there was never an issue when it came time to pay for those things from the trust. The trustee was like, absolutely, that's certainly important. We want to keep that going. The last two, so the Beyond One Day at a Time brochure, this is really just a recap of everything we talked about in this presentation. There's a lot more context in there too, a lot more detail, I should say. And then last but not least, the link to the ABLE Analyzer. So if you are interested in opening an ABLE account, this will take you directly where you want to go to set the account up. But you can also compare and contrast every state. Again, though, I would say if you're in a state with a income tax, do your state program so you can get that deduction. And that's really it. That's all I have. I think we did have maybe 1 or 2 more questions.
We do, and I can answer those. So we have a question about who we would work with for conservatorship, and I have some very exciting news that next month on the 19th as well, we will be doing the second part of our Planning for the Future series, and it is going to be all about conservatorship and all the alternatives to conservatorship. So I would encourage everyone to sign up and come to that webinar as well. And then the other question was just, is the recording going to be sent out? And yes, please, if you would like the recording, go ahead and respond back to the reminder email that was sent out yesterday, and I will make sure that you get a copy of today's recording.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Well, please let us know if you have any questions. I'd love if you reach out to me personally. We'll definitely set up a time to talk through any questions you have. Like I said, there's no cost to for any of that. So just let us know how we can help. I'd love to sit in on that session about conservatorship and the
We would
options.
love to have you. I will make sure to
Yeah,
send you the invite.
that'd be great.
Well, thank you
Awesome.
everybody today for attending. Again, please reach out to Crystal if you have any questions, anything that she can help with, and look out for the tools and handouts. I will be sending them out later today. I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your week. And Crystal, again, thank you so much for your time today. Your experience and expertise is so valuable, and we are happy to have you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. All right, take care, guys.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.